Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Truvos 2:1. This is the final part of the Shir, and I just want to review in the Mishnah. The idea is that what happens if somebody has a deliberate transgression, and then what happens if they're going to do a transgression but it's unintentional, and the Mishnah is going to list out several of these kinds of cases. The original case was going to be what happens if you're separating out tamei produce for tahor produce for truma. Now we're going to get into other related cases. What happens about Shabbat? So the end of the Mishnah says concerning someone who immerses his utensils on the Shabbos, the law is like this. It says if he did so inadvertently, he may use them, but if he did so deliberately, he may not use them. And concerning someone who tithes or cooks food on Shabbos, the law is as follows. If he did so inadvertently, he may eat the food. If he did so deliberately, he may not eat the food. Again, this is somebody who's tithing, and we're not supposed to tithe. That's going to be a rabbinic thing. And the idea is because, like immersing a tamei utensil in a mikvah, tithing is going to be a kind of repairing. And the Rambam is explaining in his commentary that it's like somebody who's making food halachically okay to eat. Now, let's get into the rest of these parts of the Mishnahs. The Mishnah stated somebody who ties and cooks food on Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Shmuel said in the name of Rabbi Abahu, this is going to be in ArtScroll 21a, that when the Mishnah is differentiating between someone who cooks accidentally on Shabbos and somebody who's going to do so on purpose, it's referring to somebody only to the inadvertent violation of a biblical prohibition. And then the question is, what about a deliberate violation of a biblical prohibition? For example, let's say a person puts a pot of uncooked food on the stove during Shabbos, and that's not going to be the same as a rabbinic prohibition, which is putting a pot of uncooked food on the stove before Shabbos. And so that law, the question is, would that be the law, the same as a violation, whether it's going to be inadvertent or deliberate? Certainly, if you're doing where you're cooking a pot of food on Shabbos, that's going to be the Doraita prohibition. Now, Rabbi Yossi the Amara says that the Mishnah itself is going to indicate it, because the way he's reading it, it's saying that somebody who cooks or ties food on Shabbos, and if he did so inadvertently, he may eat it. If he did so deliberately, he may not eat it. And the idea that Rabbi Yossi the Amara is saying is that in the case of illegally tithing, obviously it's going to talk about somebody who's separating tithes during Shabbos. And so by teaching a case together with a case of illegal cooking, the Mishnah is trying to convey that it's specifically an act performed on Shabbos itself. So we conclude that when the Mishnah is differentiating between somebody who cooks inadvertently on Shabbos and deliberately, it's going to be the biblical violation. So in other words, the Gemara says that it's referring to the inherent violation of a biblical prohibition or the deliberate violation of a biblical prohibition. So that the idea is that we're looking at what is the Doraita prohibition. The Mishnah is addressing the Doraita prohibition here, not dealing with the rabbinic prohibition. So the Gemara is going to look at this dispute on the prohibition for eating food that was illegally cooked on Shabbos. And again, Rabbi Shmuel, in the name of Rabbi Abahu, and Rabbi Yossi the Amara are both claiming that this is the Doraita prohibition. In other words, you put a pot of food to cook on Shabbos. And it's not a pot of uncooked food before Shabbos. You actually put it on the blech or on the coals on Shabbos. So the Brisa taught, and this is going to be a Tosefta in Shabbos 3.3. You can find it in the second Hulin, page 15a. And it says, concerning someone who cooks on Shabbos, if he did so inadvertently, he may eat what he cooked. And if he did so deliberately, he may not eat what he cooked. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yudah says that if he cooked the food inadvertently, he may eat it after the Shabbos departs. That's going to be Saturday night. and if he did so deliberately, he may not eat the food ever. In other words, what Rabbi Yuda's view is that the rabbis are penalizing a deliberate violator by forbidding him from ever enjoying what he made with his sin. In other words, he's never going to get ona out of it. It's always going to be forbidden. And this comes up in Masechet Kalayim when we're talking about the laws of Kalayim. And the idea also comes up for the law of eating milk and meat and getting benefit. And there's a Gezerah Shava with milk and meat and benefit, as well as Kalayim with benefit, and also with illicit relations and benefit. It's talked about in Masechet Kalayim. It's also talked about in Masechet Hulin, page 115a. And the idea is that there are two things that are happening. One is that the Torah gives you a violation. You're not supposed to do this violation. The other thing is that you get pleasure out of this act, or you can get benefit out of this act. In the case of illicit relations, that would be pleasure. That would be the consideration of benefit that you'd be getting. And the idea is that there's two things that are going to be forbidden as Gezerah Shavas, so that you're not supposed to have benefit from the milk and meat. You're not supposed to have the benefit from illicit relations. You're not supposed to have the benefit from Kalayim. Not only are you not supposed to do the Avera or the act, but you're also not supposed to get benefit from it. And that's really what Rabbi Yudah is trying to also say here as well. In other words, that you made the act. You're not supposed to do it, but you're not also supposed to get the benefit from it as well. You're not supposed to get the ona out of it. You're not supposed to partake of the food and get enjoyment out of it. So it's always going to be forbidden from you. That's the idea of Rabbi Yudah. Now, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler said that if he cooked the food inadvertently, it may be eaten after the Shabbos departs, but only by others and not by him. This is going to be a more lenient opinion, and if he did so deliberately, the food may never be eaten, neither by him nor by others. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler, like Rabbi Yudah, is forbidding the benefit from an inadvertent violation, but while Rabbi Yudah is allowing food inadvertently cooked on Shabbos to be eaten that night, even by the violator himself, Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler is penalizing the inadvertent violator from ever partaking of the food that he cooked. Because, so my mistake, that Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler is not more lenient, he's more strict, and Rabbi Yudah is more lenient. And the idea that Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler maintains is going to be that the food deliberately on Shabbos is biblically forbidden to ever be eaten. So as a precaution, it's decreed that the violator himself may never eat the food that he cooked, even if the transgression was accidentally. And this comes up in Hulin, and other people who were not involved in the transgression, they can eat the food after the Shabbos has passed, but once enough time has elapsed for the food to have been cooked in a permitted way. So the Gemara is going to talk about this, and Shmuel ruled in accordance with the strict view of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler, and there's a dissenting opinion, and it says that when Rav would rule on this matter privately for a group of students, he would rule for them in accordance with the lenient view of Rabbi Meir, but when Rav lectured publicly in the presence of the Amaratzim, unlearned people, Amaratzot, he ruled in accordance with the strict view of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler. In other words, he did not want the unlearned masses to develop a dismissive attitude toward Shabbos fences. And there's a different version of Rav's ruling in public. Rabbi Shimon bar Kasana says that Rav ruled for the public in accordance with Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, whose view is even going to be more strict than Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler's. And Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, taught in Brisa, he said, regarding the Shabbos prohibitions, anything that would make one liable to correct for an intentional violation or a hatas for an inadvertent violation. This is going to be, by the way, any biblically prohibited malacha, like cooking, and cooking on Shabbos. And if he did it on Shabbos, whether he did it inadvertently or deliberately, the product of the violation, in other words, the cooked food, is prohibited forever. In other words, both the person who violated it by cooking this food on Shabbos, as well as everyone else, can never eat from it. In other words, it's biblically prohibited forever. So this is how Rav would rule in public, especially in front of the unlearned masses. And the Gemara continues and says, however, anything that would not make one liable to correct for an intentional violation or a toss offering for an inadvertent violation. This, by the way, would be a rabbinically prohibited act. And then one performed that on Shabbos and he did so inadvertently. The Gemara says the food may be eaten after Shabbos departs, but only by others and not by him. And if he did so deliberately, the food may never be eaten, neither by him nor by others. In other words, with regards to Shabbos violations that are going to be rabbinic, Rabbi Yishmael is going to be accepting a less stringent rule. And really, the idea is that the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler is more strict, and this opinion by Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka is even going to be more strict than that. In other words, that the rabbinic restrictions are going to be very, very close to biblically linked restrictions, like what Rabbi Meir is saying. So there's another ruling. They actually asked Rabbi Yochanan, what do you say on this matter? And they want to know, because what do you do for illegally cooked food on Shabbos? Now, again, there's a couple of things going on. What if you're doing illegally cooked food and you broke a rabbinic restriction? In other words, you cooked before Shabbos. What's going to be for that? Then you have a deraita one. What happens if you cook food on Shabbos? Now, how does this relate to Terumos? Well, we also have damai. We have where you have truma that's going to be suffix. You have truma gedola that's suffix, and you have a pile of grain that might be suffix. And so the damai regulations are not definite tevel, but they're going to be rabbinic. So we want to know, how strict are we going to be for this stuff? So they asked Rabbi Yochanan, and he replied to them, and he said, I have nothing to consider except the following Mishnah. In other words, this Mishnah. In other words, it says, concerning one who tithes or cooks food on Shabbos, if he did so inadvertently, he may eat the food, and if he did so deliberately, he may not eat the food. And who is this anonymous Mishnah? This is going to be Rabbi Meir. And in other words, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the halacha is going to follow this anonymous Mishnah. And in general, he's saying that it always follows the anonymous Mishnah. Not always. It usually doesn't. It usually does. There's a case in Masechet Damai where there's an anonymous Mishnah that looks like the halacha, but it's actually not the halacha, and they made it like that so that the unlearned masses wouldn't get confused on what they should be doing, because they didn't want to uproot tithing fences. Anyway, this ruling gets challenged, and Rav Chisda heard of Rabbi Yochanan's lenient ruling. In other words, the ruling is the most lenient version. It's going to be Rabbi Meir's version. And he remarked, and he says, have the Shabbos restrictions become permitted? And, did not Rav Huna say the following in the name of Rav? And Rabbi Chia taught the same of Brisa. And he said that at first the rabbis used to say that if someone forgets a pot of uncooked food on the stove toward Friday evening and it cooked on Shabbos, and if he left it there inadvertently, he may eat the food. And if he did so deliberately, he may not eat the food. And eventually, people will become suspected of deliberately leaving the food on the stove Friday afternoon. And then later they would claim, oh, we forgot the food, and we forgot it before Shabbos or at Shabbos. And to prevent people from engaging in deception, the rabbis broadened the prohibition. They forbade them to eat any food that was left over on the stove before Shabbos, even in the case of somebody who honestly forgot to remove it. And this is going to get into what happens if people start to play games with this. This is actually going to be coming up later on in this year, where, what happens with Shvius violators. So Rav Chisda concludes his challenge, and he's saying that the ruling prohibiting the consumption of food that was left on the stove before Shabbos, even when done inadvertently, and now you're going to say this, that somebody who inadvertently cooks food during Shabbos itself is permitted to eat the food right away? So, in other words, this, why are you not similarly concerned that people, are going to deliberately cook on Shabbos and then claim that they did so inadvertently and really just make a game? And so the Gemara is going to respond. Rabbi Hillel says in the defense of Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, which is going to be basically Rabbi Meir, and it's going to say that people were suspected of deliberately leaving on the food on the stove before Shabbos because this is going to be a rabbinic decree, and they were prone to take it lightly. But people were not suspected of deliberately cooking food on Shabbos itself because that's a biblical rule. That's d'oraita. Therefore, the rabbis applied a penalty in the case of someone who inadvertently leaves food cooking on the stove before Shabbos and then forbids him to eat the food that day. Why? Because they're worried that the people would deliberately leave food on the stove, and then they would say and pretend like, they made a mistake, and then they would get to eat it. And the Gemara says, but the rabbis did not apply a penalty in the case of someone who inadvertently cooks the food on Shabbos itself. In other words, they're going to allow the violator to eat what he cooked because they're not concerned that people would cook deliberately on Shabbos under this trick of saying, oh, it was inadvertent and I didn't know or I made a mistake. So Rabbi Yochanan is, saying what this Mishnah's ruling is, that somebody who cooks on Shabbos inadvertently may eat the food right away. Now, the Gemara is going to continue the Baraisa that links, the status of food that was inadvertently left cooking on the stove before Shabbos. And the Gemara says, later the sages revised their decree, and they said that any food that improves as it cooks and condenses is forbidden if it is left on the stove before Shabbos, even by a mistake. So later on, the Gemara says the sages revised their decree and said that any food that improves as it cooks and condenses is going to be forbidden if it's left on the stove before Shabbos, even by mistake. And any food that deteriorates, in other words, it gets worse as it cooks and condenses, is permitted if you forget it on the stove before Shabbos. Why? Because there's not really a worry that you're going to accidentally leave this food on the stove on the open coals and then allow it to condense and deteriorate. So, in other words, the idea is that you're trying to say, well, what kind of food is coming out there? Did it improve? Did it get better? And there's certain foods that are considered to improve, and there's certain foods that are considered to get worse. So it says over there, and it says, and what are examples of food that improve as they condense? Cabbage, peas, minced meat. And the idea is that, well, what about whole pieces of meat? In other words, if you're going to try to serve that to guests and the meat's going to be deemed to be food that gets worse as it condenses, well, you prefer to serve better food, right? So by mincing the meat, the person's demonstrating that he does not intend to serve it to the guests, and he's considered to improve. He's giving something that's going to be considered to improve as it condenses. So the Gemara is going to add some more examples. Rabbi Tanchum bar Eli says also turnip tops and leek tops are treated as foods that improve as they condense. And the Gemara asks, what about the nature of eggs? And the question is, are they going to improve or are they going to get worse as they condense through cooking? And the Gemara looks at this, and Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, it says that, and Rabbi Yermi and Rabbi Hanina said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. It says, father, that's going to be Rabbi Yossi, went up to his house one Shabbos, and they found shriveled eggs that had mistakenly been left cooking on the stove, and he prohibited them for consumption because he considered eggs a food that is going to improve as it condenses. Now, that's something that we put in our chulent. And he said that he also found hot water that he mistakenly left cooking on the stove, and he permitted it to be used because additional cooking is not going to improve hot water. In fact, it's going to cause it to get worse because it actually evaporates, right? And so you have less of it. So the Gemara is going to talk about another incident which supports this ruling. Rabbi Shmuel bar Natan says in the name of Rabbi Chama bar Hanina, says, father and I ascended to the town of Hamas Geder, and they served us shriveled eggs that were small as chizra fruits. What's a chizra fruit? It's a little type of crab apple. Anyway, it says those eggs were as tasty as caperberry husks, and basically what it's trying to say is that these are going to be getting better as they are cooked longer. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a relevant discussion to this. The Brisa taught that a woman may not fill a pot with asisios, or white lupines. Now, the white lupines are going to be a type of bean, and also the asisios are going to be a type of bean. And in other words, you can't put them, says the Gemara, on the oven Friday just before dark. And the idea is that you're worried that you're going to stir the coals on Shabbos in order to hurry it up to get it to cook. I mean, these kinds of beans need to be done well before Shabbat because they do take a long time to cook. They're dried and they're hard. And the Gemara says, and if she violated this rabbinic prohibition and did place them in the oven on Friday before dark, they're prohibited for consumption even after the departure of Shabbos until time has elapsed where they could be permissibly prepared after Shabbos. So Rashi is saying about this that the idea is that you're not supposed to benefit from prohibited activity on Shabbat, and that is very much in accordance with what some of the Tanaim are saying is, well, what's the status of this? Are you going to be strict, lenient, very strict? So, and again, this is broken up into two parts. What about if it's done before? What if it's done during Shabbos? In other words, what happens if we have a D'Rabbanan restriction? What happens if we have a D'Oraita restriction? This, by the way, is a D'Rabbanan restriction of cooking before Shabbos. And the Gemara is going to talk about a dispute on the exact case. And Rabbi Acha says that the Brisa refers specifically to a deliberate violation of law. And the ruling, by the way, is, says the Gemara, in the view of Rabbi Meir, who's saying that food that was intentionally cooked on the Shabbos is forbidden until after Shabbos. And if the beans were left in the oven by mistake, there'd be no consequence at all, says Rabbi Meir, because he's saying that food cooked on Shabbos without intent to transgress is permitted right away. That's the very lenient position. And the idea is that only food, according to Rabbi Meir, that intentionally is cooked on Shabbos is forbidden. Now, Rabbi Yosei is saying that the Brisa refers even to accidental violations of law, and that's going to be a ruling in accordance with the view of Rabbi Yehuda. His view, by the way, was more strict. It was the middle approach, and the idea there was that food that is cooked on Shabbos, even accidentally, may not be eaten until Shabbos has departed and enough time has elapsed that the food could have been permissibly cooked by then. In other words, the idea is that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if somebody accidentally cooked food beforehand, which is going to be a rabbinic issue, he's saying that the restriction is going to be where you have to, it's as if you started cooking Motzei Shabbos and you have enough time to cook that you could have done it Motzei Shabbos in a permitted way. So if it took me 4 hours to cook my beans, maybe 5 hours, then you can eat it 5 hours later. So, you know, if Shabbos is coming out at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the winter, you can eat your beans maybe sometime around 11. That's the idea that Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Now, there was a more strict view that said that you can't eat it at all if it was prepared on Shabbat, and it can never be enjoyed by anybody, not even the guests or other people. That was the more strict ruling, but they're not going to go that way. Now, the Gemara is going to support Rabbi Yossi's approach, and the Gemara says that Rabbi Mana said that Rabbi Yossi spoke well in asserting the Brisa reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda. And there's a different Brisa that, you know, is going to be, also getting into this other issue that is like what Rabbi Yehuda says, but also conveniently gets into what the Mishnah says, right? Mishnah is going to be talking about inadvertent violations in Shvius, and we're in the Shvius year. But the idea here is that Rabbi Yehuda is basically going to be forbidding somebody to partake in food that was accidentally cooked on Shabbos, not only that entire day, but until enough time goes by where after Shabbat, the food could have been permissibly prepared. So that again is the middle position. Now, what about Shabbat? And so and Shvius. And why is that? Well, the Torah refers to Shvius as the Shabbat of years. So very convenient. We're now getting into Shabbat and Shabbat. And the idea is what happens if you planted a tree on Shabbos. This is going to be the Shabbat of weeks, of days, right? So 7 days, and you plant it on the seventh day. And it says if he did so inadvertently, he may retain the tree. But if he did so deliberately, he must uproot it. And regarding somebody who plants a tree during Shvius, which, by the way, the Torah calls the Shabbat also Shabbat, but it's going to be the Shabbat of years. And concerning somebody who plants a tree during Shvius, regardless of whether he did so inadvertently or deliberately, he has to uproot it. Now, it's a little bit, there's a lot of nuance that's going to be going here. And the Tana of this Mishnah, Rabbi Meir, is basically going to be saying that, as we're going to be seeing, that there's a stringency here, and with regards to planting on Shvius and regards to planting on Shabbos. In other words, Rabbi Meir, who was lenient before, partially because you now have a d'Rabbanan restriction on before Shabbat and inadvertent things, and also what happens if inadvertently you did it. What happens if you inadvertently did it on Shabbat itself? Well, over here it's saying that if he did so inadvertently, he can retain the tree, and that's going to be a lot like what we have with Rabbi Meir is ruling with. If he inadvertently cooked the food on Shabbat, he can retain the food. But if he did so deliberately, he can't use it. Also over here, with planting inadvertently on a tree, if he did so inadvertently, he must uproot it. Now, on Shvius, that's going to be very strict. Rabbi Meir is going to be saying that you have to uproot it. Why? Well, because he's saying whether it's deliberate or inadvertent, you have to uproot it. That's a very strict opinion. Now, why is that going to be? Well, we're going to get into a lot of Marasayan issues, because when you come up to Orlah, 4 years later, people are going to know, hey, wait a second, I can count backwards and I can tell that this is a tree that was planted on Shvius, whether it was inadvertent or deliberate. Everybody's going to know that this was a tree that was planted. So even if you did it inadvertently, Marasayan, people are going to say, oh, well, maybe the guy's a Shvius violator. And Rabbi Yehuda in this Gemara is going to say that the reverse is true of these statements concerning somebody who plants a tree during Shvius. If he did so inadvertently, he can retain the tree. And if he did so deliberately, he can uproot it. And concerning somebody who plants a tree on Shabbos, this is what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, whether he did so inadvertently or deliberately, he must uproot it. Now, why is it that Rabbi Yehuda is going to require that planting a tree on Shabbos is going to be uprooted, even if it's an accidental transgression? In other words, you didn't mean to do it. And the Gemara is going to say, evidently, because if we were to retain that tree, the benefit of the Shabbos violation would be upon him. In other words, he would be deriving a benefit from transgressing a Shabbos law. And so Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the reasons that were given before about planting on Shvius, and he's holding that because the Shabbos prohibitions are very severe, in other words, stoning or karet, that the rabbis are decreeing that you have to avoid deriving any kind of benefit from Shabbos violation, even if the violation was done accidentally. So accordingly, Rabbi Yehuda is more strict, and he's saying that the tree that was planted on Shabbos, whether it was even accidental, has to be uprooted, because otherwise somebody would be coming along and benefiting from the additional growth and fruit that came because somebody planted a tree on Shabbos, even accidentally. And you're not supposed to benefit from Shabbos violations, says Rabbi Yehuda, even accidentally. Why? Because Shabbos is so strict, right? You have karet and stoning if you're getting it wrong. So Rabbi Yehuda is holding that the food that is prohibited after Shabbat would be done so as long as it took the time for you to cook it during Motzei Shabbos. That's how long you can do before you can start to use it. Again, that ends up being the middle position that we covered, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka had the most strict opinion, where he said that it's forbidden for everybody, not even even other guests who come along, and even after. Anyway, the idea, says the Gemara, is because you're going to say to a person, wait after the departure of Shabbos until enough time lapses and the food could have been permissibly prepared, and it is then as if the person has not benefited from the Shabbos violation at all when he eats the food. In other words, Rabbi Yossi's understanding, Rabbi Yehuda's view, which is going to be that even the accidental violator should not be allowed to get any benefit from a Shabbos violation. Rabbi Yehuda's view seems to be consistent, because he's saying that, well, if it took you 5 hours to prepare it, You don't get a discount where you can eat it right away. You have to wait 5 hours because otherwise you'd be ending up getting a benefit for a Shvius or a Shabbos violation. Now, the first Tana of this Brisa and also the Tana of this Mishnah are holding that somebody who accidentally planted a tree on Shabbos can hold the tree, retain it, and if you did it during Shvius, he has to uproot it. So what's going to be the difference? The Gemara is going to say, what's the reason that these rabbis, these Tanaim, who treat an inadvertent violator of Shvius more stringently than the inadvertent violator of Shabbos? And there's going to be explanation. Now, the Gemara says, and a lot of this gets into Marasain, right? Because a lot of this is determinable because you look at Orla and you can tell, oh wait, these fruits are now permitted. Wait a second, I can count back and be like, hey, that was a Shvius here. So people, says this Baraisa, are suspected of deliberately violating the laws of Shvius under the guise of doing so accidentally, and to prevent this deceptive practice, the sages decreed that any tree planted during Shvius has to be uprooted, even one that was done actually inadvertently. So people are not suspected of deliberately desecrating Shabbos, and they're going to generally treat Shabbos restrictions more seriously. So the sages didn't find it necessary, basically, to require somebody to uproot a tree that was planted on Shabbos, even if it was done accidentally. Now, the Bryce is going to give an additional reason for this distinction between the planting done during Shvius and the planting done during Shabbos. And again, this links back to the Mishnah that we're dealing with. It deals with these, purposeful versus accidental violations. And one of the things in the list is going to be planting during Shvius. And there's a different reason. People will count back to the Shvius year when calculating the tree's age with regards to Orla or Rev I. And they're going to, figure out that the tree was planted during Shvius. And to prevent this misconception that the planting was done in a accidental way, they're going to say that, okay, it has to be uprooted even if it was done accidentally, to prevent people from coming and saying, hey, it was an accident, so I can keep it and benefit from this violation. And they don't want you benefiting from these violations, so they're going to basically say you have to uproot it. But, if somebody goes and he plants, 3 years later or 4 years later, if it's a grapevine, they're not going to count back, says this Gemara, from Shabbos. In other words, people are not going to calculate the age of a tree in days. They're only going to do it at a later date on Orla. And you're not going to have a way 3 years later to say, oh, it was done on a Shabbos. So these Tanaim, like in that Baraisa and the Mishnah, are saying that it's basically not necessary to uproot a tree that was accidentally planted on Shabbos, because there's not going to be a Marasain issue much later, years later, and it's not going to be really calculable years later. But, if you are planting even accidentally on Shvius, you're going to be able to know it because you can't use the tree until the third year, and everybody's going to sort of notice it. And certainly it's going to be a Marasain issue. So the Gemara is going to ask and say, what is the case that illustrates the practical difference between these two reasons? In other words, where somebody says, if Gemara planted a tree at the end of the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, that, by the way, is going to be less than 30 days before Shvius, and then the tree's growth that enters the Shvius year, and now the tree took root during Shvius. In other words, he's planting, and we covered this in the second Shvius in chapter 2, and it's teaching that if you planted within 30 days of Shvius. By the way, chapter 2 is about orchards and trees. So if you planted within 30 days, they're saying that, you can't plant within 30 days because it really takes 30 days for a tree to take root during any period of time. And then if you're planting less than 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, then it's really done taking root inside of the Shvius year. You've actually planted a Shvius tree. So the question is, well, what about 30 days before the Shvius period? Is that also going to be where you have to uproot it, even if it's going to be inadvertent? So the Gemara is going to say that if you're going to say that the reason that the tree is planted inadvertently during the Shvius, that it has to be uprooted, is because of the suspicion and Marasain that people will deliberately plant during Shvius and then claim that they did so accidentally. Here is the case we're discussing where there's no such suspicion. In other words, if you have a tree that was planted before the onset of Shvius, then the tree doesn't need to be uprooted. What's the difference here? Okay, the difference here is that if it's done 2 weeks before, did you really violate Shvius? Yes. Are they going to demand that you uproot it 3 years later? No, because people aren't really going to be able to determine that 2 week gap, right? But did you do wrong in Shemayim? Yes. Right? If you were playing a game, did you do wrong in Shemayim? Yes. Should you uproot it? Yes. If they catch you planting a tree like this within 30 days before Shvius, will they make you uproot it? Yes. But will they go and do that 3 years later after your Orla elapses? No, they're not going to, because again, you could, maybe it was, done a couple of weeks earlier, within the permitted time. But if you have it where it was dafka, like absolutely clear, where it was planted within the 7th year, and you can calculate out Orla and figure out that it really was an intentional violation, or even accidentally, but it actually lands within this period of time during the Shemitah year, they're going to make you uproot it. So the Gemara is saying, but if you're going to say that the reason that the tree planted inadvertently during Shvius must be uprooted is that people will count back to the year, and then they're going to deduce that the tree was planted during Shvius. Here too, there's a concern that people will count back during Shvius when they're going to calculate the age for Orla. And, then what happens with a tree planted within 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, So since people are going to assume that this tree was planted during Shvius, maybe you would say, well, you'd have to uproot it, and even if it was done inadvertently. So there's going to be another difference between the tree that was planted just before and one that was for sure planted during Shvius. And there's another difference in the case where somebody planted a tree at the end of Shvius. In other words, less than 30 days before the beginning of the 8th year, and the tree's growth entered the 8th year. In other words, the tree ended up rooting in the 8th year following Shvius. Now, in this case, although the tree took root during Shvius, the actual planting was illegally done by putting it into the ground during the Shvius year. And so what about that? In other words, Gemara says, if you're going to say that the reason a tree planted inadvertently during Shvius must be uprooted is because of the suspicion people have when they deliberately plant during Shvius and then claim they did it accidentally, here too, there's a basis to impose a penalty on account of the suspicion. So, in other words, the idea is that maybe people will question the time before and after Shvius, and also take in the time to for the tree to root. So if you're going to say that the reason that a tree planted inadvertently during Shvius must be uprooted is that people will count back to the year and deduce that the tree was planted during Shvius, here there's no concern that people will count back to the Shvius year. In other words, that if it's planted 2 weeks before the end of Shvius and it's going to end up taking root in the 8th year, did you violate Shvius? Yes, because you planted. You're not allowed to. But 3 years later, 4 years later, when it's going to come up for Orla, well, are they going to try to count back and figure out with suspicion whether this was, definitely planted within the 7th year or 8th year? They're not going to. So the implication of this Mishnah is going to be that a tree that was planted at any point during Shvius, even during the last 30 days, has to be uprooted. So, in other words, what they're saying is that, maybe there is room where right at the edge people will be suspecting it. And so it looks like any tree planted any time during Shvius is going to be subject to this uprooting requirement, even like 2 weeks before and done 2 weeks before the end of Shvius, 2 weeks before Shvius. And the Gemara is saying that our Mishnah is consistent with the one who says that the requirement to uproot a tree planted inadvertently during Shvius was instituted because of the suspicion that people will deliberately plant during their 7th year. Because of that reason, it's understood why the tree has to be uprooted even if the planting took place during the final days of Shvius. However, according to the one who says that the requirement to uproot the tree inadvertently during Shvius was instituted because of the fear that people will count back to the Shvius year, the reason is not applicable with regards to a tree planted at the end of Shvius. In other words, the question is, did the sages, say the Gemara, penalize an inadvertent violator because of concern about a possible deliberate violator. So what this is trying to say is that they did not. In other words, the ruling of this Mishnah is implying that even a tree planted accidentally during the last 30 days of Shvius needs to be uprooted, and that's based on the first reason, which maintains that the sages did penalize an inadvertent violator in order to deter a potential deliberate violator. In other words, don't look at counting back as the reason. In other words, what they're trying to say and determine from this is that if you planted just before Shvius, or you have a tree that popped up just after Shvius, are they going to make you uproot it? Yes. Why? Because they're trying to make sure that they're not benefiting a violator who had, maybe a potential deliberate violation. That's, in other words, what the takana is. In other words, the fence is that like that. It's not to say like, oh, maybe somebody will count back, so you don't need to worry about, like counting back and looking at the time just before Shvius or the time just after Shvius. That's not the reason. They're saying that even the time before Shvius and the time just after Shvius for a tree, you're going to have to uproot those as well, because we're not going to look at the inadvertent violator. We're going to try to deter the potential deliberate violator. And so when you're looking now about the laws of Shabbos or the laws of separating Terumos, it's actually going to end up being more strict. This rabbinic fence is actually going to end up being more strict, where we're trying to deter a potential deliberate violator, and we're not trying to rule softly on this. So the idea is that if somebody's planting inadvertently, or they're separating Terumos inadvertently, or they're violating Shabbos inadvertently, again, the sages did penalize the inadvertent violator. Why? To make sure that people aren't going to play games with it and really, claim that it was inadvertent, but really it's a deliberate violation. Have a great day.